All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Vivek Ponnada, the Senior VP of Growth and Strategy at Frenos, is joining me today. Vivek has been an OT cybersecurity fixture for many years, involved in such important initiatives as the Top 20 Secure PLC Coding Practices Project. He's also a frequent speaker at S4 and other important industrial-focused cybersecurity conferences. So I am very excited that Vivek is here and that he gets to share some of his experience and expertise with you, the listeners. So before we start, just a quick reminder, my usual reminder to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. I really need to thank the stellar lineup of guests I've had this year. The quality of the content has really exceeded my expectations, and I have a lot of cool folks lined up, especially with Black Hat on the horizon. So we are on all the major podcast platforms, so I encourage you to subscribe. It's really the best way to keep up, and it helps up the show. So thanks again. So let's bring in Vivek and start today's episode. How are you? Good to have you on.
Thank you, Mike. Glad to be on as well.
We've been kind of communicating over email and stuff, but I certainly have known of you for a while within the industry, and I'm sure you kind of like have a pretty unique perspective on just like the continuing maturity of OT cybersecurity as a practice. And, you know, I'm just curious, just your take on kind of this evolution over the past 5 years, for example, just where we were and where we've gotten to at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, past 5 years has seen quite a bit of change. In general, as you're aware, OT security has been very slow to evolve, right? People used to joke about how we're like 10 to 15 years behind IT security, if not more. But off late, we've seen a lot of focus on this missing OT security discussion in the enterprise space. So not only did the technology evolve to kind of catch up with what OT security people need to utilize to kind of do overall risk management, but also the awareness and the general public being inquisitive about, hey, we need to do something about critical infrastructure security. So that all has kind of helped the cause, I think, overall in the past few years.
Can you point to one or two things that have really driven that? Is it just connectivity and just kind of escaping the air gaps, or is it something else?
Interestingly, it's not from within, right? So I come from the OT space, the ICS space. For years, you know, back when I was doing PLC programming or starting up gas turbines and whatnot, we never thought about security, right? That hasn't fundamentally changed even today. So the people that are in the automation space, yes, they have some awareness compared to years past, but the focus on security came from external, right? So whenever a major event happens, you know, when 2015, 2016, Ukraine, blackouts happened, or most recently in the US when the Colonial Pipeline, was shut down on purpose because they weren't quite sure how to handle the ransomware on IT, possible impact on OT. When these external things happen, a lot of people question, what is this? What is this OT security that we're talking about? Are we prepared? I thought we were good, with all the controls we have in the IT space. Turns out, we have this huge gap where the production happens, where we actually make revenue, but we have no clue what's in there. So that kind of outside-in perspective helped kind of bring the industry to a higher level compared to what it was before, so that we can now start looking deep in and kind of figure out what the gaps are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the conversations today are so different than a relatively short time ago. I mean, you go to S4 today or even Black Hat RSA, where they're starting to have tracks on cyber physical systems and OT. The conversations are just so different and so much more nuanced today than they were even 5 years ago.
Yeah. A few years ago, there were a few, right? So obviously the OGs of OT security that have been doing this for 15 plus years, there are just a few handful, right? So
Sure.
you know them when you see them. And those guys had to kind of look at you in a knowing, understanding fashion when you say, I have no clue about OT security, and kind of try to teach you for 101. Now, of course, there's a lot of content out there, lots of, podcasts, thanks to you as well, right? So lots of awareness awareness in general. Most IT security people are somewhat aware that there's a whole segment out there within their own enterprises that they're not as familiar with and they need to know. So a lot more awareness. So now, even the number of people, right? So as for 15 years ago would have been just a couple hundred people. Now it's more than 1,000 people.
Right.
So if people can go to one of the most premier conferences and spend 3 or 4 days, that's one thing. But there's also a lot of regional content. There's also within different countries, focus on ICS specific events and conferences, and even B sides have ICS or OT security talks these days. So I think overall where we are is much better in terms of awareness and having to think about OT security compared to a few years ago.
Yeah. And I guess just kind of staying on this theme of maturity or evolution, I mean, you're seeing OT security practices kind of evolving beyond like having just asset inventory in place or just a vulnerability management in place. I think that those are kind of expected and foundational at this point. What are you seeing in terms of just kind of that evolution beyond these foundational kind of practices?
I agree. When there was nothing, right? So we had to start with something. So whatever controls you kind of picture, whether it's the CI stop 18 or any kind of standard, including the 62443, one of the basic foundational tenets is let's kind of figure out what you have, right? And that's why the asset inventory focus for the past decade or so. Now, obviously, once you have quality asset inventory, matching vulnerabilities is not that difficult. So those two kind of go hand in hand. So these were kind of the initial steps that most organizations took, but that's not the end goal, right? So that's just the basic step before figuring out what to do with that information. So the overall risk management approaches will kind of more align with how IT thinks about stuff, right? IT doesn't stop at thinking about asset inventory and vulnerability scans. They think about controls, they think about risk, they think about what are the mitigations they can put in place, both in terms of layers of security as well as, the cost that it takes to kind of fund this risk management overall. So OT security is definitely moving towards that. While the initial steps of asset inventory or vulnerability management might have taken maybe 80-90% of the conversation, people are now realizing those are just initial steps that
Yeah.
now lead to the actual risk management conversation.
Right. They enable so much more. And I think that's kind of the part of the conversation that,
Right.
we finally arrived at. That, yeah, okay, this has to be in place, but here's what you can do with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, I know I've been hearing some conversations and around the need for more contextual information and, discussing kind of threats and risk in terms of business impact. I'm just curious if you're hearing the same thing. What are you seeing around, especially this additional demand for context around risks and threats to these devices?
Yeah, it's funny that for years people used to say that, oh, we're air gapped, so we're good, right? That so unknowingly they were providing this context that, hey, I'm isolated, I'm segmented from other connectivity, so I'm managing my risk that way. The reality is nobody was air gapped. People did have a lot of connections, both internally to IT and to external cloud systems. Many of them were simply not aware. But that's just one context, right? The other context would be, like a lot of folks know, most attacks, ransomware or otherwise, start from the IT side and then, have the possibility to go into the OT side. However, there might be other compensating controls in place that would prevent the attack. But again, that's contextual, right? So let's say in level 3, you got some kind of controls for segmentation, or maybe you have application whitelisting, or you have some other ways, like if you had disabled RDP, for example, that particular attack surface is kind of managed well, right? But without that context, historically, what we've been saying and talking about is as if everything is at risk, that all OT assets are at risk, all vulnerabilities are high priority. That doesn't scale, right? So even if the traditional asset inventory and vulnerability identification project kind of resulted in a lot of information, very little of that information was put to use because there was a missing context, right? So if the vulnerability is tied to remote desktop, or if the vulnerability is tied to SMB, however, if those particular ports and services were disabled because they followed best practices in doing this project or in the automation phase, they had less of a risk compared to if they had those things enabled. But that contextual discussion was kind of missing because it was still a maturing industry, if you will, right? So now we're seeing a lot of people saying, hey, I get it. I'm not air gapped. I totally understand that we're way past that discussion. However, I do have other compensating controls. I do have other ways to mitigate this risk as opposed to just simply talking about patching like we do in the IT security space, right? So
Right.
a lot of people are figuring out that OT security has to be handled better, but we also have other tools that can help us do that better.
And in terms of context, I mean, how are you defining it in as an example here? I mean, is it because I would imagine like all the information is there. It's a matter of kind of pulling it together and making a story out of it, so to speak.
Yeah, for the most part it is. So, I work for Frenos now, and we define context in a couple ways. So, one, ingesting firewall or segmentation or routing information, we can create a network replica or a digital twin, if you will, right? But then the other context about which ports and services are enabled or disabled, sometimes the customers might be able to provide that information, right? So if you have some kind of tools, maybe you have an EDR tool, at least at, in the Purdue model level 3 or level 2, if you happen to have that kind of tool, you might be able to export and provide the context. In other situations, you can play with these scenarios where, within this network replica or digital twin, you can add manually. You can say, hey, you kind of manage risk by showing this replica that there are other compensating controls in place, so you can add that manually. So whether you're able to manually export it from an IT type tool or an OT specific tool, or you can add manually, either way, most of these compensating controls fall into different categories, right? So it's not a stretch to kind of add that across a network as opposed to adding that at each individual asset level. So yeah, the long and short of it is you can export this kind of contextual information from some kind of automation, or add that manually if need be.
And all of this information obviously helps security teams prioritize and mitigate risks. What are some challenges on that front that you're seeing specifically to OT and industrial organizations?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key point, right? So at the end of the day, analyzing risk is one aspect of it. Like, what do you do
Mhm.
with the mitigations is the second aspect. Historically, and as you're well aware, right, patch management has been a big problem in OT because one, patches might not be available. Second, the patch window might not be available. And of course, validation, testing, all kinds of issues with a patch management program like in IT. However, we have had very good controls in terms of segmentation, in terms of kind of isolation, in terms of allow listing and deny listing. We we don't have to start from scratch anymore, right? So the past 10 to 15 years has shown us what other things work really well. And in some cases, they override the need to urgently do something, right? So I always use the Log4j example. I remember, and that was an IT security deal, right? For the most
Right.
part, over the Christmas, people had to spend a week having to repatch, 3 times because, every couple of days they would get an update that, oh, we just issued a patch, but that patch still has a problem. So another patch comes along. That was an IT where people did not sleep from Christmas through New Year. In OT, we wouldn't sleep throughout the year if you have to think about patching only, right? So going back to your question about mitigation, a lot of times the mitigation recommendations kind of fall under patch management, right? It could be misconfiguration, it could be segmentation, it could be even visibility, right? So, hey, you got to this network and it's pretty straightforward that you can, move laterally within this network, but I'm not able to see beyond this, right? So you had
Mm-hmm.
some sensors, you had some knowledge of, the assets and vulnerabilities up to this level. However, beyond this is not very obvious. So oftentimes lack of visibility, and again, this is not a, one size fits all, right? So some folks and some sites or enterprises, they have a very flat network, and so they have to deal with their risk very differently. Maybe segmentation is their first step. In other cases, people have segmented. Maybe they followed a standard, and maybe they kind of did a Purdue plus security model
Yeah.
application there. For them, maybe it's not so much segmentation, but they need to think about other aspects, right? Like allow listing or deny listing or something else within their environment. So not everybody can deal with the same problems the exact same way because the systems are different, the risk to the enterprise is different, and of course the availability of resources and budget. So many other things that come into play when people start thinking about what mitigations work best in their environment for a given cost, right?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the digital twin concept earlier, and I'm just curious how that helps organizations, for example, understand their attack surface in the context of OT securities. And maybe a second part to that is like, how do you know you're ready for that? Because I imagine there's some barriers there, whether it's cost or expertise. I mean, what's your experience in that respect?
Yeah, that's a good point because digital twins have been around for a long time, right? So a
Right.
lot of folks have, especially in the process industries, have used digital twins for some kind of performance mapping, some kind of scenario playing. Very few have applied that in security, right? So the way we thought about digital twins are, hey, let's not focus so much on the process, but focus on the network. So let's replicate the network, leveraging the firewall or router or segmentation information. And then um, once you overlay that with asset information and vulnerability information, you can then start thinking like an attacker or an adversary in this network, right? So you kind of simulate how a Volt Typhoon or a ransomware actor might behave in this. And part of this is only possible because of the more recent developments in AI, right? So while everybody knows about the large language models, for OT specifically, there are better ways to do it as opposed to a general purpose large language model. We can build, and which is what we did here, build micro learning models specific to OT adversarial behavior, right? That way it's smaller, can run on-prem. But the overall concept is that, build this digital twin of the network, overlay that with asset and vulnerability context, and now you can think about how an adversary would approach this network, right? So once they have access to, let's say, level 4 or level 3, whatever the assumed breach situation is, right? From there, how would they pivot? Where would they go? What kind of movement or privilege escalation or lateral movement would they have? And having that analysis done for you will help you kind of figure out if you're a red teamer, what would be the logical next step for you to kind of take in the real world, right? And if you're a blue team, we're going to figure out how you can defend against it. So if the most common pathways that the red team or this adversarial simulation is taking happens to be based on this one asset that has a lot of vulnerabilities at level 3, maybe focusing on vulnerabilities there is important. However,
Mm-hmm.
if on the other hand, there are many paths, and most of them happen to be because of easier privilege escalation. Maybe you'll have some kind of control on user management, some kind of zero trust approach, right? So what you could do both on the red team side and the blue team side is now very evident because before you didn't have the scale, right? Because you could do a
Right.
tabletop, you could, come up with one scenario maybe for one network and one site, but this was not scalable. The other aspect of it is a lot of sites have this context already, right? So they might have installed Clarity, for example, and they have a rich amount of asset inventory and vulnerability identification, and that they're already using for some kind of risk management. Now they can use that for this kind of scenario playing and adversarial simulation to say, oh yeah, this path is the riskiest for me because this goes straight to my crown jewels. So let me actually mitigate this. And the mitigations are not necessarily in the vulnerability management only, right? So they're also in the segmentation or configuration management. So there are other aspects in managing risk, but what really makes a difference in this digital twin approach is that you're playing with this, completely on-prem, but also leveraging your own existing data sets as opposed to, manual work or scenario playing using a tabletop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of, I guess, my follow-up question is like, what are the inputs and the outputs of this? I mean, it's your visibility and your vulnerability, information and status, but like, is this for everybody? I guess is what I'm asking, because like not everybody has an APT in their threat model, for example. I mean, is there a preferred audience for this kind of approach, so to speak?
Now that's a good question. No one is focused on APTs for that matter, right? Because in OT, especially, we've seen this. The level of APT activity might be higher for certain industries, certain countries, maybe at certain periods. But for the most part, most people have to deal with misconfigurations, maybe some kind of internal network that is laid out bare for lack of focus on or other things. But the reality is, nobody needs to worry about who is attacking, right? As opposed to where their risk is, because oftentimes people stop doing things because they either look at this vast amount of work that needs to happen in terms of OT security. So that includes vulnerability management. That includes a lot of old technology, obsolete technology. Lots of sites that are never accounted for, and there was never a good place to start. Right. So most projects technically were very linear. So they would put together a budget for asset inventory tools and spend the next 2 to 3 years building that out. Similarly, they might have a segmentation project, and it might take a couple of years to get through all their sites.
Right.
But overall, this was a very linear approach where during that phase, if the management or leadership was asking the question, "Hey, how are we doing on the investment? We spent a few million. Are we better? Are we less risky at this point?" It was not that easy to answer that question, right? Forgetting APTs for a second, even just for their own internal assessment of what their security risk posture is, it was never easy to understand where they are, if they were improving, if whatever they're doing is actually helping, right? Now, with this kind of adversarial simulation in this digital twin concept, you can answer that question even on day one, right? Let's say you
Mm-hmm.
have missing information, you know where to focus on because this attack path analysis would show you, what assets are easy to get to, right? You can look at what your crown jewels are, what the business impact is for your key sites, as opposed to making this very linear. That way, the immediate outcome for someone that's starting all the way to someone that's much more mature is that they can now start talking about risk, right? And in a way that their management understands and be answerable to say, hey, yes, we invested this kind of money and this is the risk posture right now. And over time, we're improving, right? Or, we're
Right.
doing all these different things in line with our risk management process. And that's an answer that a lot of managers or leaders would appreciate because now we're not just talking technically, not just talking about work and tasks, but something that's relevant to them, right? Something that's
Right.
more about risk management.
I want to go back to vulnerability management in OT for a second. And we all know the challenges. I mean, in terms of like downtime and, just this overall hesitancy to patch everything. It's never going to happen. But that kind of explains why traditional vulnerability management isn't a fit. But like, in terms of bringing this contextual approach, are we talking about a bigger basket of exposures, for example, that helps prioritize remediation and mitigation efforts? Just where do you see vulnerability management in OT going in the next couple of years?
Yeah, that's a good point because historically, we try to teach, people different ways to manage vulnerabilities in OT because the traditional IT type approach doesn't work, right?
Right.
In IT, if something is exposed, if it's vulnerable, let's go patch it, right? So the question there was, when is the next patch window, as opposed to, oh, wait a second, what is the impact on the production if we patch it? Do we even have a patch, right? Next outage is 6 years down the road. How do we mitigate this? So in OT, we had, for example, decision trees, right? So the various components of the decision trees include, what's the impact of this asset going down, what's the risk for applying the patch. The other ways to add context was, using the CISA KEV, right? So the
Yep.
known exploitable vulnerabilities. There's also the exploit prediction scoring system, EPSS. All these were used as part of decision trees and modeling to say, okay, I got 10,000 vulnerabilities. Some of them are known to be exploited, others could potentially be exploited. And then you come from 10,000 all the way to 1,000, right? But 1,000 vulnerabilities is still nearly impossible to manage in OT, right? Because the first and foremost problem is that outage is not available. The patch has other risks. So what we deal with is not a bigger basket, not more rules, not more decisions to make, but this is based on their own network and segmentation, right? So when Sarah, which is the adversarial simulation within the Frenos platform, is looking at the various attack paths. She's thinking of the complexity of getting this attack to be successful, the number of hops it takes to get to a crown jewel, the different types of exploits to use or different types of vulnerabilities to take advantage of. All that comes together as a calculation to say, hey, it is pretty easy to get to this particular network, or it is really difficult to get to this network because all these other compensating controls are working against it. And then you can come up with a much, much smaller list of vulnerabilities that you want to patch for various reasons, right? So one, like the example I gave before, hey, this vulnerability is in this level 3 device that in theory, even if it's shut down for 10, 15 minutes, it's not going to impact production. But this happened to have, not just as vulnerabilities, maybe also these other services that are running that are in theory exposing you to more risk, but not necessarily for your operation. Maybe you do want to patch that one. On the other hand, yes, this PLC is vulnerable, but you have all these other compensating controls, so that it's really hard to get to that PLC. It's hard to get to this PLC network. So why don't we deprioritize that, right? So now we're really talking about fixing things that matter as opposed to thinking very linearly and coming up with this calculation. So
Right.
thousand we talk about might be now just a few dozen, right? So it's a significant difference when you think about what vulnerabilities really matter for your risk posture, for your security posture, as opposed to let me just boil the ocean and come up with a much smaller list.
Yeah. There's so much value in getting to a dozen from 1,000 overall vulnerabilities or whatever the issue is. Yeah, I completely
Exactly.
agree.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time talking about prioritizing risk mitigation. Let's talk about prioritizing investments. I mean, we're in a very complicated economic and geopolitical climate right now. Not a lot of companies have the resources they did a couple of years ago, maybe, especially in complex environments. Just how is the current climate impacting investments? And maybe a second part to that is compliance going to even take a bigger role in terms of driving security programs?
I mean, both key points, right? So, money
Yeah.
and people, nobody has enough to answer all their questions and solve all their problems, right? So, we have to prioritize because of that. I always like to think about, where would you invest your next dollar or where would you invest your next hour of your resource? That always has to come first when you're thinking about any kind of planning for mitigation, right? So, historically people didn't get a chance to do that because there was so much to do, right? So you could do anything and that would definitely improve whatever you're doing. But once you have a certain level of maturity, once you have a certain level of visibility into your organization, now comes that key question, right? Like, are we doing the right things? So investing in people obviously is one key aspect. The other thing is investing in certain toolkit or certain technologies that can take you to the next level. Same thing, right? Like, is this the right kind of investment? If you're able to identify, what are the key risks and, where you want to reduce risk most, that kind of helps you figure out, which kind of resources are required to solve that problem, right? Or what kind of money is required to, de-risk that particular aspect. And oftentimes these two intersect, right? Where you might have a segmentation project in mind already. So now instead of focusing on site A first, site B next, site C next, you would start working on the riskiest site in your enterprise. That might be site F for that matter. Similarly, you might have a change management firewall rule update plan for every Monday, for example. So instead of doing it, once a week, very linearly going through, top down all the firewall rules, you might only focus on, what the key configuration changes or recommendations from this attack path analysis. So either way, the focus would be, instead of anything linear, anything very structured, you focus on what is reducing the most risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then going back to the second question about compliance, we fortunately or unfortunately didn't have a lot of regulation in OT security, for that matter, globally, right? In North America, obviously, NERCSIP in the power sector, and more recently, TSA regulations for transportation happen to be the only ones for cyber physical system regulation. But globally, that is changing, right? So obviously, Europe is focused on NIS2. Other countries like Australia recently is adding 62443 standard as a requirement for critical infrastructure and cyber physical security. So I think compliance will become a much bigger deal than it was in the past, and it will still have to kind of go through the investment planning, right, that most companies have to go through. But we're in a better shape than we were in the past, right? So past compliance checklists were notorious for just being those checklists, not necessarily de-risking.
Yeah.
But the one advantage we're seeing in the more recent standards and regulation development is that most of these are risk-based, and as opposed to rule-based. So they're giving individuals a lot of leeway in figuring out what is the best investment that reduces their risk, as opposed to thou shalt do these 5 things, and
Yeah.
that's the list that you have to comply with.
Mm-hmm. All right. Before we wrap up, Vivek, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. But I have to, I guess, ask the obligatory AI and machine learning question. Um, just, what's the role, or what roles are you seeing AI have around OT security? And where are we in terms of making the most of these advanced technologies within industrial environments?
Yeah, it is interesting that OT historically has used some level of AI, and even more so than other environments, right? Because we have used anomaly detection for a long, long time in OT. We do have a lot of data sets, which is a prerequisite for a lot of learning models. So we're actually primed for leveraging more AI in OT, right, than some of the other industries, if you ask me. In fact, I wouldn't have my current job if not for AI and machine learning. So I strongly believe that there are so many use cases that we have barely touched, and we will see more and more AI in OT, not because it's the next big thing in terms of public knowledge. It's just because we have so many data sets that historically have not been leveraged, right? So, I mean, I remember back in my oil and gas days, 2D and 3D seismic was such a normal thing, and the investments in technology made there were probably leap years ahead of any other OT investments in the same space, right? Similarly, the AI investments and machine learning applications within OT are just so much more in terms of possibilities. And the one kind of downside to more of these data sets is that they're not in the cloud, right? So a lot of OT personnel are still hesitant to leverage the cloud. So there was a gap in the past few years where they had all this data, but it wasn't centralized in the cloud. It wasn't easy to kind of transfer to a location where learning models could work. But now, because of the development of more on-prem capability, more micro learning models, we are able to then keep the data still on-prem and take advantage of all the newer learning. So yeah, I strongly believe that we're on the cusp of leveraging even more AI, compared to even the general public, because we just happen to have those rich data sets that we can take
Yeah.
advantage
Yeah. I don't think we'll have a choice.
of. Yeah.
All right, Vivek. I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think people are really going to enjoy this conversation. So thanks so much for your time.
I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for having me.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye now.